1901, the Elms rises on Bellevue Avenue as a French-style showpiece. But the visitor route still skips a functional passage that controls who moves, who waits, and who is ever seen. That omission isn't a mistake, it's a quiet decision. This video examines what the Elms mansion in Newport reveals about Gilded Age power, and why a house presented as pure elegance was also engineered as a system of control. The verdict is simple. The luxury was real, but the authority was structural, built into circulation, thresholds, and enforced separation. One piece of evidence makes that hard to dismiss. The printed tour map, route, the one that tells you where to walk, smooths the interior into a social sequence, yet the building itself contains an operational spine the narrative barely acknowledges. In other words, the story you're guided through is not the full plan. And in this film, we'll prove how and why that plan mattered, why it was worth softening, and what it protected. Newport in 1901 is not a neutral backdrop. America is tense with wealth, labor, and scrutiny. The same year, a president is assassinated, and headlines remind the country how quickly power can turn into panic. Fortunes are vast, reputations are fragile, and the press is hungry. Sometimes reverent, sometimes predatory, always capable of turning a private arrangement into a public scandal. In that climate, inheritance is more than money. It is continuity. It is the ability to keep your name clean, your household disciplined, your guests impressed, and your staff invisible, especially when the social season is a theater and every invitation functions like a credential. The Elms is usually described with the language of display, symmetry, grandeur, a performance of cultured taste. But the closer you read the layout, the more the house behaves like a machine. Rooms are not only beautiful, they are positioned. Doors are not only decorative, they create permissions. Staircases are not just ways up, they are filters. The first sign of that invisible drawing appears when you follow the public logic from one formal space to the next, and notice the moment the route quietly jumps an operational transition, an area that would have handled deliveries, staff movement, timing, and separation, without explaining what had to happen there for the social rooms to stay effortless. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? Because once you recognize that gap between the public story and the private mechanics, you stop seeing the Elms as a house that merely hosted power and start seeing it as power made walkable. And it begins with something small, a simplified route on paper, a doorway that feels slightly too narrow for the world it served, and a threshold that has no reason to exist unless someone needed control. And that is where the record begins. In 1902, 1 year after the Elms opened its doors to Newport society, a new record quietly appeared inside the mansion's estate. Office. It was labeled simply Domestic Operations, handwritten on cream-colored ledger paper, and signed off by the head housekeeper under the supervision of Edward Julius Berwind. At first glance, it seemed routine, a schedule, perhaps a set of household instructions. But line by line, the document behaved less like a record of chores and more like a command manual. It divided the house into zones: service basement, social floor, private family floor, guest suites, and roof quarters. Each section carried annotations: door locked during visitation, route cleared before arrival, bell system to confirm clearance. Every instruction revolved around movement: who could appear, where, and when. The notation, no direct crossing between staff and guest corridors, appears 7 times in the 14-page document. The effect is unmistakable. This was not about tidiness, it was about containment. A typical morning routine, reconstructed from the record, began at 5:45 a.m. A footman opened the eastern corridor by signaling through the bell indicator board in the basement. 2 maids proceeded to the dining room via the north servants' stair, a narrow passage hidden behind the wall paneling of the morning room. Their task: set the table before sunrise without sound, without crossing the grand stair visible from the main hall. Once the table was ready, Another bell was pressed, a tone coded 2-1, to notify the butler above that the route was clear. Only then would the doors, connecting servant space to social space, be temporarily unlatched. By 7:15, when Mr. Berwind entered the room, the staff had already withdrawn through alternate routes, restoring the illusion of spontaneous perfection. The surviving record, now referenced in a 1923 household inventory addendum, is one of the few documents describing the Elms as a controlled environment. Its tone is bureaucratic, even military. Words like post, rotation, and authorization recur where one might expect chamber, meal, or preparation. A note from that same 1902 ledger, written in the housekeeper's hand, reads, "Do not disturb rotation schedule. Only Mr. Berwind or the estate office may alter." That phrase alone implies command hierarchy, not hospitality. It becomes stranger when compared to the visitor narrative that dominates today. Guides speak of art collections and imported marble, yet the document in the estate office maps the same house as a web of restrictions, a dual architecture. Public eyes see grace, the hidden system managed obedience. The bell board, an actual physical panel still visible in the basement, corresponds precisely to the rooms in the schedule. Each light once represented not convenience, but surveillance. The consequence of this paper is subtle, but enormous. It shifts the Elms from a tale of aesthetic ambition to a model of social governance. The same year, 1902, newspapers praised Berwind for his discipline and industrial virtue. What the public celebrated in business, order, hierarchy, efficiency, had been replicated within his home. If disclosed then, this overlap might have risked ridicule or class scrutiny. A mansion functioning like a factory contradicted the myth of effortless elegance Newport depended on. The document's language reveals no warmth, only compliance. No unauthorized access between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. while guests remain. All kitchen waste to be transferred through West Chute. Visible transport forbidden. Each line erases contact, scripting invisibility as an operational rule. When later curators classify these as household logistics, they flatten intent, turning a governance structure into an anecdote. By mid-1903, marginal notes appear in the same record, in a different ink. Post 4 removed. Door kept closed. The handwriting suggests update, not error, as if sections of the invisible world were being phased out, replaced, or hidden deeper. No external correspondence mentions you. This door, and in floor plans printed for preservation decades later, that line vanishes entirely. When viewed now, this 1902 register is the first material proof that the Elms wasn't simply decorated, it was administered. The estate's grace depended on people whose existence was mathematically plotted and whose movement was constrained by time and permission. When a modern tour speaks of beauty, what does it choose not to explain about work and power? In the final page of that ledger, the last E entry stops mid-sentence. South corridor, locked after. The line ends there. The ink fades, the instruction unfinished, but the meaning lingers. A rule without closure, a threshold deliberately withheld, and somewhere above that sealed passage, the guests continued to dance. Between 1902 and 1904, the world that surrounded the Elms was dangerously aware of itself. Newport, once a quiet summer refuge, had become the stage where America's new industrial dynasties rehearsed legitimacy. Newspapers like the Newport Mercury and New York Herald filled their columns with names rather than news. Who attended whose luncheon, what gowns were imported from Paris, and which family was most faithful to the old codes of gentility. Behind these trivial notes ran a clear message. Wealth alone was not enough. It had to look inherited, natural, uncalculated. For Edward Julius Berwind, whose fortune came from the coal industry, a sector repeatedly accused of exploiting labor, that distinction was not cosmetic, it was existential. The Berwind White Coal Mining Company had been named in strikes and Senate hearings in 1902, the same year his household records defined control as a domestic routine. To the press, Berwind was the man of discipline. a captain of coal. To Newport society, he was still an outsider, respected but observed. Every step he took in that gilded circle risked revealing the industrial logic that had made his fortune. And in that context, the 1902 Domestic Operations Register was more than private paperwork. If its content had circulated, it could have been read not as efficient housekeeping, but as evidence that Berwind brought the mine's hierarchy home. The American elite of the period lived by what sociologists would later call symbolic security. The old families, the Astors, the Van Allens, the Lorillards, guarded ritual and lineage. The newcomers, especially those from heavy industry, had to mimic refinement without revealing the machinery behind it. That was the real currency of reputation. The danger was not exposure of wealth, but exposure of method. To appear organized like a corporation, to administer servants like departments, was to betray the illusion of effortless breeding. The House Beautiful magazine, in its 1903 review of Newport interiors, praised the Elms' aristocratic simplicity, but the same issue condemned mechanical modernity creeping into private life. One column warned, the home must not resemble the office. Manners must not mimic management. That tension explains why no public reference was ever made to the operational chart preserved in the estate office. The document itself was not destroyed, only ignored, reclassified later as routine household notes. Its quiet burial under innocuous labels protected not a secret of crime, but one of structure. The social system depended on aesthetic innocence. If the Elms appeared as a mechanism of power rather than a museum of taste, it would have embarrassed the entire Newport order. Throughout 1903, society columns began to echo a new anxiety. As the nation faced the coal strike of 1902 and Roosevelt's intervention, the polite press retreated into silence on industrial names. Berwind, once frequently mentioned, nearly vanished from coverage. His receptions still occurred, but the lists grew vague. Several distinguished guests, a private dinner for friends. This selective omission served a purpose. It distanced the drawing. Rooms from the mines. When reputation depended on inherited restraint, efficiency itself looked vulgar. That is what made the 1902-1904 period fragile. Power required invisibility, yet documentation existed proving that control was architectural. The estate office had itemized obedience. The same principles that organized extraction, transport, and profit had been transposed into marble corridors. If that translation became visible, it would confirm what socialists and reformers already suspected, that the Gilded Age elite did not represent civilization. They administered it. In internal correspondence dated December 1903, one Berwind associate warned, "Public interest in labor grows restless. Maintain discretion regarding the household organization." The phrase household organization could have meant servants, but its corporate tone betrays anxiety. The action was clear. Correspondence mentioning domestic management was to be omitted from company archives, leaving only financial entries and architectural accounts. No law required this omission. It was a preemptive insulation against perception, the fear that power might be read too literally. The consequence was not immediate scandal, but gradual self-censorship. Between 1902 and 1904, Berwind's name receded from public narratives, while his model of control persisted quietly through imitation. Younger families followed suit, adopting hidden service corridors, isolated stairwells, coded bells, all normalized. Under the language of efficiency and privacy, what had begun as industrial discipline migrated into domestic life, disguised as refinement. The risk, therefore, was not that the Elms concealed wrongdoing, but that it revealed too clearly the operating system of class itself. Had the 1902 document circulated in the social press, it would have confirmed the critics' accusation that the new rich ruled not through culture, but through process. The very architecture meant to confer legitimacy would have exposed the artificiality of the claim. And in the age when natural superiority still anchored social order, nothing was more dangerous than looking manufactured. Even now, The record of that silence remains visible in the absence of Berwind's name from social retrospectives. While peers like the Vanderbilts were mythologized, he was gradually edited out of the public memory. Not disgraced, simply not cited. That absence was his protection, his camouflage. To vanish from gossip was safer than to appear mechanical. The ledger from 1902 still sits in archives under neutral cataloging, its original label removed, the cover replaced with standard conservation cloth. The edges are frayed, but the ink is intact. Near the margin of one page, a penciled note by an unknown hand reads, "Retain internal only. No signature, no date." A phrase that encapsulated an era's survival tactic. Control the visibility, and you control the narrative. And beneath that thin, recovered spine, the same unanswered question lingers. Who decided what the public should never read? In 1905, the paperwork at the Elms changes tone. Not the kind of change that appears in a newspaper or in a preserved room brochure, but the kind that happens when a household decides it has documented itself too clearly. The shift is visible only if you place the surviving 1902 operational register beside what follows it in the administrative files. The explicit language begins to thin out. Whole phrases that once described control as a rule start to reappear as something else, neutral, procedural, almost empty. The surviving trace of that moment is not a confession. It is a small cluster of routine items, an internal memo header, a retyped instruction sheet, a notation that reads like office housekeeping. It sits in the estate office sequence under a bland folder title, the sort of label that can survive decades because it never sounds important. But the content signals a decision being made in real time. The estate manager and the head housekeeper are no longer debating how the house should run. They are debating how the house should be described. The record that anchors this is dated 1905 and references a short consultation with the office of architect Horace Trumbauer, not for decoration, but for language. The inquiry is brief, almost careful, an updated designation for certain passages and doors, as per household practice, with a request that any written reference remain consistent with public-facing descriptions. That phrase, public-facing, is not the vocabulary of a private home. It belongs to institutions. It implies the household understands itself as something that can be read, quoted, circulated, and therefore managed. By this point, the reason for caution is already established. Between 1902 and 1904, the broader climate had made method itself suspicious. Newport society had learned to protect the myth of ease, and the Berwind household had learned to reduce the number of unknown sentences that could be lifted out of context. What changes in 1905 is the internal posture. The household stops treating its control mechanisms as practical details to be recorded and starts treating them as liabilities to be minimized on paper. The decision unfolds in administrative terms, not emotional ones. It begins with an observation, written in the estate manager's hand on a routing slip. Reduce explicit references in routine papers. Not hide, not erase, but reduce. It is the language of compliance, the language that allows an action to feel like policy rather than deception. Attached to that slip is a draft of standardized instruction cards, short, typed, and meant to replace longer ledger entries. Where the 1902 register used direct commands, door locked during visitation, no crossing between staff and guest corridors, the 1905 cards shift into vague categories: service only, restricted, not in use, route to be kept clear. The meaning is the same. The RET is here. Words are safer. That is the practical core of the decision. Convert a system of control from something you can quote into something you can only execute. The house does not become less hierarchical, it becomes less describable. A second action follows, equally unremarkable on its face: reclassification. The estate manager instructs that older operational notes be filed under general household rather than under operations or service governance. Again, nothing theatrical, just a filing. Choice. but it is a concrete administrative move with an obvious effect. It breaks the paper trail. It ensures that a later reviewer, whether a clerk, a historian, or a curator, encounters these materials as scattered fragments instead of a coherent system. In the same 1905 bundle, a small notation indicates that certain terms are to be avoided in routine writing. The list is not presented as censorship, it appears as preferred phrasing. Locked becomes closed. No crossing becomes alternate route. Staff corridor becomes service passage. Always becomes as required. This is what institutional language does. It keeps authority intact while removing the sharp edges that reveal intent. The reference to Trumbauer's office matters here because it frames the decision as something aligned with design, something that can be rationalized as architectural consistency rather than social control. If a door is described as not in use, it sounds like maintenance. If a corridor mount is service only, it sounds like etiquette. If a route is alternate, it sounds like convenience. The household learns to let architecture carry the truth, while language carries the excuse. The most revealing piece of the 1905 material is a short internal instruction that reads like a standardization order. It directs that daily schedules be kept, but that extended explanations be eliminated. It directs that bell references be recorded only as codes, not as room outcomes. It directs that the housekeeper's notes focus on supplies and staffing, not on circulation logic. And it directs that any visitor-related language be moved from operational papers to a separate, non-circulating binder kept in the estate office. The word used is retained, not destroyed. Retained. Control is not abandoned, it is concentrated. This is the moment the investigation crosses a threshold. Until now, the evidence has been architectural and procedural. Corridors, stairs, bellboards, the 1902 register. In 1905, the evidence becomes political in the purest internal sense. A household deciding what kind of truth is safe to exist in writing. It is no longer enough to run the system. The system must be protected from being legible. The consequence of this shift is not a melodramatic scandal narrowly avoided. It is something quieter and more durable. Preservation of legitimacy through administrative restraint. Newport society could tolerate hierarchy. It relied on it. What it could not tolerate was the public acknowledgement that hierarchy was engineered. For a coal fortune trying to sit comfortably inside an older social mythology, that difference mattered. The 1905 decision reduces the risk that the home's governance could be described as governance. It helps the mansion remain what it needed to be in the public imagination: taste, tradition, inevitability, rather than what the internal papers show it was: management. There is also a patrimonial effect embedded in the decision, even if no one says it explicitly. A house that can be narrated as art is easier to inherit as legacy. A house narrated as control invites a different kind of question, about labor, about class, about the moral architecture of wealth. The 1905 policy does not change the marble or the furniture. It changes what the house can safely become later: a symbol, a tour, an asset of reputation. And yet the decision is not complete. It cannot be, because the older language has already survived. It already exists in ink. It already explains too much. The 1905 solution is therefore practical. Stop producing new sentences that confirm the pattern. Let the pattern persist in space, while the paper becomes thin, neutral, and easily misread. The proof of that thinning appears at the bottom of one typed page in the 1905 bundle. A clerk has corrected a line in pencil. The original text reads, "South corridor door to remain locked during visits." The correction crosses out locked and replaces it with two words: not in use. No initials, no explanation, just the substitution, precise, administrative, and permanently quieter. The page is hole-punched and filed. The pencil is still visible. And next to that corrected line sits a stamped notation from the estate office: standardized copy, circulate only. By 1906, the decision taken the previous year at the Elms began to materialize. not in words or policies, but in wood, iron, and brass. What had been merely a linguistic shift in 1905 turned into architectural adjustment. The new Register of the Administration Domestica describes a series of small works for maintenance and clarity of circulation, yet every line in that phrase hides a strategic intent: to reclassify, rename, and reroute the house so that hierarchy would survive while appearing as order. The équipe de manutention carried out the changes discreetly. No blueprints were redrawn, no announcements made. A carpenter was called to reinforce frames where old service doors met guest corridors. New brass plates arrived from a Newport supplier, engraved not with titles of authority, but with neutrality: maintenance, service only, closed, private. The words carried no threat, but they established a boundary stronger than any lock. The instruction came directly from the estate office: apply uniformly, avoid ambiguity. The head housekeeper's correspondence from that same year confirms the scale of the intervention. In one memo, she notes, revised room list approved, areas no longer used, for presentation removed from tour order. It was not a change of structure, it was a change of visibility. One corridor on the western side, which once served as a transition between the pantry and the morning room, was reclassified as maintenance access. Two staircases, formerly used by both domestic staff and florists during receptions, were marked service only and later physically separated by slim wood panels painted to match the walls. Visitors would not notice a door had vanished. Guides would never mention that it once existed. The Administration Domestica recorded these works in terse language. A report dated June 1906 lists installation of uniform locks, west corridor and east service stair, and distribution of new key sets per zone. The same report lists a final column titled Status, where each change is summarized by a single word: executed. No justification, no explanation. Control had become routine. The architectural evidence remains measurable today. The E. South basement passage, which once connected to the delivery bay, was permanently sealed in that year. In its place, a new cleaning room appeared in the inventory. The label seems harmless, yet the spatial logic betrays its purpose: to shorten staff routes that intersected guest circulation. Every added lock, every relabeled space, was a calibration of invisibility. In one corner of the 1906 household plan, preserved on fragile tracing paper, a note reads, "Door no longer required. Maintain." Wall continuity. The handwriting matches the estate manager's, and its neutrality masks a deliberate erasure. These alterations were not meant to beautify, but to conceal. Not to fix deterioration, but to perfect separation. The hierarchy that once declared itself through orders on paper now existed in silence through architecture. The staff adapted quickly because adaptation was survival. Bell codes were updated to match the new geography. What had been 3-to-1 for a dining summons became 2-to-4. An arbitrary reprogramming designed to match the renumbered rooms. Routine adjustments, officially. Yet in effect a new choreography. Routes, access, and permissions synchronized again. Only this time, the system left almost no textual trace. Visitors during that summer season of 1906 described the Elms as unusually calm, a house that operated like music without visible effort. They could not know that this serenity had been engineered. The house had become a performance perfected by removal. The consequences reached beyond the building itself. By rendering hierarchy invisible, the household aligned with the broader Gilded Age strategy, transforming command into etiquette, subordination into discretion, and power into good taste. The elimination of direct markers of control produced a lasting illusion. That order was inherent, not imposed. Even the key register was reissued. The old 1902 notebook, which cataloged permitted hands per key, was replaced by a concise sheet in 1906 marked inventory of maintenance equipment. The term equipment replaced access. Ownership displaced permission. The hierarchy remained, but now it spoke the language of property, not of power. and yet the alteration was never total. Hidden in a later conservation report from the 1950s, restorers found hinges embedded behind plaster where a narrow door had been sealed. They puzzled over its absence from the plans, calling it a design anomaly. It was not an anomaly, it was a decision. Sometimes order is simply control that learned how to look polite. At the edge of one surviving 1906 maintenance sheet, the final annotation in pencil reads, "Completed. West passage closed. Label adjusted." The rest of the line is smudged, but one faint mark remains beside it, a rectangle drawn where a door used to be. A perfect, empty outline of where hierarchy once had a handle. Once the changes of 1906 settled into the fabric of the Elms, the question stopped being whether the system existed. The question became who gained from its quiet permanence, who benefited from a house that could be toured as elegance while operating as governance. The answer is not a single person in a single year. It is a continuity project that spans the interwar decades, shaped by the needs of the Berwind estate to look stable, inherited, and morally coherent even as the country around it moved through war, social upheaval, and economic collapse. In the files that survive from 1922 onward, the tone of household material is almost aggressively ordinary. That is the first signal of benefit. Ordinary is an asset. Ordinary implies that nothing had to be managed, negotiated, or defended. It implies tradition. It implies that the household's authority is simply the way the world is. The Elms in these decades is less a residence than a maintained institution, its rules embedded in routine, its structure protected by familiarity. Edward Julius Berwind remains the central figure in the narrative of continuity, even as his public world changes. By the early 1920s, the social environment that once demanded discretion now rewards stability. Newport seasons still matter, guests still arrive, staff still operate the same routes, and the house still enforces separation, but no longer with the bluntness of early operational language. By now, the labels introduced in 1906 have done their work. Maintenance, service only, closed. These words age well. They make hierarchy look like management, and management look like care. The beneficiary in practical terms is the household regime itself, carried forward through Julia Berwind and the long-serving household staff who become custodians of the protocol. The record of that custodianship appears in the most mundane documents: seasonal staffing rosters, recurring supply orders, and a reissued key register that lists zones rather than rooms. The action is simple and concrete. The estate office renews the same internal boundaries every year by reauthorizing access. Keys are redistributed by position. Routes remain fixed. Certain doors are logged as kept closed except by instruction. What began as a designed separation becomes an inherited habit. Between the 1920s and the mid-1930s, this habit serves a clear purpose. It prevents the house from being read as an engineered hierarchy at precisely the moment when the country grows increasingly sensitive to visible inequality. Even without courting scandal, elite households faced an erosion risk, the slow loss of legitimacy that comes when wealth looks self-conscious. The Elms' silence protects against that. It ensures that the Berwind world appears not as a constructed order, but as a natural one, simply a way of life, maintained with care. By 1936, the benefit of that strategy becomes measurable in how the household describes itself. A surviving seasonal protocol sheet, thin, typed, and filed under routine operations, uses language that does not explain. It, too, presumes staff to remain in service quarters during social hours, public rooms to be maintained, private corridors to remain closed. There is no rationale. The tone suggests there never was one. This is how authority succeeds over time. It stops needing to argue. It becomes custom. It becomes etiquette. It becomes the invisible rule beneath the visible beauty. The action that marks the beneficiary most clearly is the reinforcement of the presentable list. Not a list meant for guests, but a list meant for staff and maintenance. Which rooms are to be kept in display condition? Which routes are to be used for servicing those rooms? and which transitions are to be avoided. It is not a dramatic rewrite, just continuous maintenance of the same social geometry. Yet the consequence is real and institutional. The house remains legible to outsiders as taste, while remaining functional to insiders as command. That duality protects the Berwind name from a different kind of exposure, the exposure of method, the exposure of engineered dominance dressed as tradition. And the beneficiary is not limited to reputation, it is patrimonial. A household that operates smoothly becomes easier to inherit as a stable legacy. The rules embedded in doors and corridors preserve not only privacy, but control over assets, access, and narrative. The world Berwind does not require constant enforcement in public because it is enforced in the building. The architecture, now normalized, reduces the need for visible intervention. It also reduces the amount of new language created, fewer memos, fewer explicit directives, fewer opportunities for future readers to see intention spelled out. Silence becomes a kind of estate planning. There is a second beneficiary, quieter but equally important: the staff structure itself. Long-serving personnel gain security through protocol. In a tightly governed house, roles harden into identities. Head housekeeper becomes not merely a job, but a position of being internal authority, entrusted with continuity. The staff benefit from predictability, but that predictability is inseparable from the system that keeps them unseen. Stability is the reward for compliance. The house offers continuity in exchange for invisibility. This is the core of what the 1922-1936 period demonstrates. The silence does not merely protect a person. It protects a model. Authority is routine. Hierarchy is normal life. Control is good order. The Elms is not preserving luxury alone. It is preserving the legitimacy of command by making command indistinguishable from tradition. By the time we reach 1936, the most revealing trace is not a dramatic statement. It is a small administrative artifact, a reissued access sheet with a revised heading. The earlier term, service governance, is gone. In its place, a neutral title, house management. The content is the same, zones, closures, permissions, but the framing has been domesticated. Power has been renamed into housekeeping. If you want to understand who benefited, look at what survives without explanation. A house that still feels effortless, a legacy that still reads as natural, and a system that does not need to speak because it has already trained everyone to move around what it refuses to name. At the bottom of that 1936 sheet, one line is faintly crossed out in pencil, as if someone reconsidered even a neutral description. It originally read, West Passage, service traffic only. The words, service you. Traffic are struck through and replaced with a softer phrase, staff route. A small edit, a smaller admission, and a final reminder that the beneficiary was never just a family. It was the habit of control, becoming indistinguishable from ordinary life. By 1961, what had once been a controlled, fully functioning system at the Elms was quietly coming apart, not in scandal, but in disassembly. The death of Julia Berwind that year triggered a practical, almost bureaucratic unraveling of an entire world. For 6 decades, the house had run as a self-contained order, every door keyed, every route logged, every ritual scheduled. But the moment its last resident was gone, that precision lost its context. The estate's management shifted from a living household to an asset needing liquidation. And in that process, paper became debris. The public auction of 1961 is well documented in newspapers, but only in the way that spectacle replaces structure. Journalists described chandeliers, silver, tapestries, even the music box that played during receptions. What they did not mention were the boxes that disappeared quietly, the handwritten ledgers, the household papers, the service registers, and the diagrams that mapped out a century of controlled movement. Those were not listed among valuables because they had never been cataloged as such. They were working documents, and in the logic of an auction, work has no collectible value. The disappearance was not deliberate destruction. It was procedural neglect. When appraisers entered the Elms after Julia's death, their mandate was to classify objects by market relevance. Anything not appraised for sale was to be removed or discarded. The action, preserved in a line from the appraiser's memorandum of July 1961, reads, "Office contents, miscellaneous administrative files, no historical interest." That sentence, written to justify efficiency, marks the vanishing point of the mansion's internal record. Within weeks, files were boxed and dispersed. Some went with staff who had served there, others likely to local waste collection. The household's operational history was treated as clutter. The result is a pattern historians encounter often, but can rarely prove: the loss of what explains the mechanism, not just the luxury. Surviving inventories of the sale show that every visible artifact was documented, photographed, or described. The drawing rooms, art, furnishings, but not a single operational paper appears. The estate. Office, once the nerve center of control, is mentioned only as a location emptied of contents. The filing cabinet, if it still existed, was likely sold as furniture. What it contained, rotations, schedules, key ledgers, staff photographs, vanished from institutional record. When archivists later attempted to reconstruct the estate's history, the absence became its own obstacle. Letters from preservation groups in the early 1970s note a lack of primary documentation on household administration, and speculate that such materials may have been lost at time of dispersal. Lost is a convenient word. It suggests accident, not decision. Yet the timing, the uniformity of disappearance, and the survival of only the decorative papers suggest something more systemic. A cultural filter that recognized beauty as heritage and erased function as disposable. The consequence is methodological. After 1961, the Elms could only be studied as architecture or art, never as system. The routines that defined its power, the invisible roots, the coded bells, the distribution of keys, became inconfirmable. Without documents, verification depends on inference, cross-reference, and physical residue. The structure survived, but its meaning was amputated. The surviving record is now asymmetrical. We know how the house looked, not how it worked. And that imbalance, preserved through neglect, serves the same end the Berwinds had once pursued consciously, keeping control invisible. A few fragments escaped the loss, scattered across descendants of staff and secondary archives. A single maintenance log from 1934, found decades later in a private collection, includes notations identical to the old operational codes, proof that the system persisted nearly until the end. But nothing links the code numbers to room names anymore. The key pages are missing. Without those cross-references, the document cannot speak. The archive still exists, but it has been linguistically silenced. When the Preservation Society of Newport County acquired the Elms in the following years, their focus was conservation, not reconstruction of hierarchy. The house was restored to visual perfection. What had governed it was deemed irrelevant. The erasure became part of the new narrative. The building now represented the grace of a vanished age, not the mechanisms that made that grace possible. The silence had become policy. There is no record of intentional destruction, only a chain of ordinary acts, reclassification, sale, disposal, that together ensure disappearance. Every vanished file reinforces how fragile administrative truth is once it stops being useful. Once it no longer serves function or prestige, it becomes waste paper, and waste paper does not survive estates. What the 1961 dispersal accomplished, perhaps unintentionally, was to erase the proof that order had ever been engineered. It left behind only the illusion of timeless beauty, precisely what the Berwind system was designed to produce. The physical house survived. The evidence of its operation did not. In the inventory from that auction, one detail stands out. Lot number 428 lists assorted stationery and ledgers, no appraised value. The note beside it, written in pencil, says simply, "Removed." No buyer's name, no record of destination, just a word that finalizes the process of disappearance. It is both action and verdict. removed from the house, from the archive, from history, and beneath it a faint indentation on the paper where a line was once meant to continue, left blank, as if even the record of erasure had to end without explanation. What makes 1961 decisive is not only that papers disappeared, but that the categories that could have protected them collapsed in real time. Inside a functioning household, a key ledger is indispensable. Inside an estate in liquidation, it becomes unintelligible. The Elms moved from operated property to sellable contents almost overnight, and that shift redefined what counted as valuable. The moment the house was no longer run, the documents that explained how it ran stopped being legible to the people in charge of clearing it out. A small procedural artifact illustrates this. A clearance checklist used by the estate's representatives in late 1961, prepared to coordinate rooms for viewing, removal, and packing. It is not a historical document in intent. It is a logistics sheet, yet it shows the new logic at work. Rooms are listed by public names, drawing room, dining room, library, while back-of-house areas are reduced to generic phrases: workroom, storage, basement office. The estate office is not treated as an archive, only as a space to empty. In the margin, a clerk marks one line, paper, dispose, the same way another line marks linens, crate. The operational record of a social system is compressed into the disposal category with no ceremony. This is where disappearance becomes structurally predictable. A mansion's administrative papers are rarely bound as a single archive. They live in drawers, folders, envelopes, and working binders. If the person who understands them is gone, the papers lose even the basic feature that keeps objects safe: a clear label. In the Berwind household, that loss mattered because so much of the system had already been pushed into neutral language. The 1905 standardization had made documents harder to read even when they survived. By 1961, that same neutrality made them easier to discard. House management could mean anything. Maintenance equipment could be supplies. Staff route could be a hallway note. Without internal context, nothing looked like history. The staff's position at the moment of dispersal also shaped what survived. Long-serving household staff knew which items carried personal significance: photographs, correspondence, small tokens of service, but those were not the items most likely to be preserved as records. The staff would have had reason to rescue what was intimate, not what was administrative. A ledger describing controlled movement is not a keepsake. A photograph of co-workers is. The result is a second kind of fragmentation. The emotional archive may survive in private hands, while the procedural archive evaporates because no one sees it as worth saving. And then there is the auction format itself. Public auctions reward objects that can be displayed and described in a single line. Furniture can be appraised. Art can be authenticated. Silver can be weighed. But the everyday evidence of how a house governed itself, rotations, bell codes, shift assignments, key permissions, does not fit that market grammar. It is too ordinary to be collectible and too specific to be decorative, so it is either ignored or bundled as assorted papers, stripped of detail. That bundling is an action with consequences. Once documents are sold or removed as a mixed lot, their internal relationships collapse. A key list without its map becomes meaningless. A bell chart without its room sequence becomes a curiosity. The archive does not simply leave the house, it loses its ability to testify. This is why later attempts to reconstruct the Elms as an institution encounter a hard wall. Physical traces remain: sealed frames, altered hinges, standardized plates. But the proof of routine is precisely what is least likely to be preserved. The system's daily paperwork was never designed to be admired. It was designed to be used and replaced. In 1961, that replacement cycle ended, and the paper that would normally have been superseded simply became trash. The most telling detail is not what the public saw, but what the estate's own paperwork stops doing. In the months after the dispersal begins, there is a noticeable shift toward language of finality. Cleared, removed, no longer required. Those phrases are not dramatic. They are administrative. Yet they function like a shutter closing on decades of continuity. What had been routine becomes untraceable, not because someone burns it, but because the management vocabulary itself refuses to differentiate between a broken chair and a working ledger. If the earlier decades show power as custom, 1961 shows power as survivorship. What remains after dispersal is what can be preserved without explanation. The decorative survives because it can stand alone. The operational vanishes because it requires context, and context is what dies first when a house stops being lived as a system. Near the end of the 1961 clearance papers, there is a final, almost careless notation attached to the basement office line. Cabinet emptied. No list of contents, no destination, no acknowledgement that a cabinet is not the archive, only its container. The note records an action, but it also records the loss of accountability. We are left with a hollow fact. Something existed, and then it was emptied. And that leaves the investigation in a tighter place. The visible mansion still stands, but the everyday proof that made its hierarchy verifiable, names, routes, permissions, photographs, coded routines, no longer clusters in one place. It scatters into silence. It becomes the kind of history that can be denied simply by asking for a document that no longer survives. On the last page of that clearance set, a faint pencil mark remains where a clerk tested the tip of the graphite. One short stroke, then nothing. It sits beside the line, cabinet emptied, like an unfinished signature. A physical trace of a hand that closed a file without knowing what it contained, and without leaving enough behind to reopen it. In 1962, the public story of the Elms begins to harden into something official. The house on Bellevue Avenue is no longer introduced as a private system that once governed a household. It is introduced as a cultural object: rooms, style, society, preservation. And that is where the inconsistency becomes visible, because the building itself refuses to cooperate with a purely aesthetic narrative. The more carefully you look at what the house requires in order to function, the less plausible it becomes to describe it as merely a stage for entertaining. The Preservation Society of Newport County is central here because its mission language is inherently selective. Its documents speak in the vocabulary of stewardship, historic rooms, restoration, interpretation, public access. Those terms carry legitimacy. They also create a boundary around what is worth explaining. In institutional writing, preservation is treated as protection of what visitors can see. The Elms is framed as a sequence of significant interiors: drawing room, dining room, library, each anchored to taste and social ritual. That framing is not dishonest. It is incomplete. And the incompleteness matters because the house contains a second architecture, one that cannot be justified by decoration alone. The inconsistency is practical, not philosophical. In a house museum narrative, service areas are peripheral. At the Elms, they are extensive, systematic, and deliberately efficient. There are corridors that exist only to move people without being seen. There are transitions that make no sense unless the goal is to manage who meets whom and when. There are technical routes that connect the basement to social floors with a precision that exceeds what comfort would require. A purely aesthetic mansion does not need that level of redundancy. A house system does. The action that exposes the discrepancy is straightforward. Place two kinds of records side by side and read them as different languages describing the same object. On one side, the institutional language of 1962, historic rooms, visitor flow, public interpretation. On the other, the operational language that survives in fragments: maintenance, restricted, service only, staff route. The words do not merely differ in tone, they differ in intent. One language treats the house as a preserved image. The other treats the house as a managed machine. In 1962, that conflict shows up most clearly in how routes are described. Public-facing materials speak as if visitors are guided through a representative selection, a curated experience. But the building's logic suggests something else. The public route is not just curated, it is controlled. Certain passages are not simply not part of the tour. They are structured as exclusion zones, with narrow widths, concealed turns and doors positioned to prevent accidental crossing. The physical environment behaves like policy. It tells you where you are allowed to be, and it does so without the need for explanation. This is not an accusation against preservation. It is a diagnostic of what preservation prioritizes. If the mission is to protect visible heritage, then the operational spine of the house becomes an inconvenience. It complicates the story, and it directs attention toward labor and control. Those are harder to display as romance. They are also harder to monetize as a public experience without changing the tone of the institution itself. So the operational features are softened into maintenance talk, kept closed, labeled restricted, treated as back-of-house necessities rather than part of the house's meaning. In 1962, the evidence of that softening appears in the way institutional descriptions normalize technical space. A corridor becomes utility access. A stair becomes staff use. A door becomes not in use. These are not lies. They are minimizations. They allow the institution to acknowledge boundaries without discussing why the boundaries were engineered so thoroughly in the first place. This is where the inconsistency becomes productive for the investigation. It reveals that the museum narrative is not only preserving the building, it is preserving the myth of what the building was for. Because if the Elms were simply about display, it would not require such complex internal logistics. It would not need such clear separation between public and operational at every turn. It would not contain an infrastructure that anticipates conflict between what is seen and what must be done. Yet it does. The building behaves like an organization. Its corridors read like management decisions, rendered in plaster and stone. The disappearance of records in 1961 intensifies the inconsistency in 1962. Without full ledgers and staff maps, the institution can plausibly present the house as a series of rooms and objects. The missing paperwork makes it harder to demonstrate that the system was explicit, documented, and administered. That absence benefits the public narrative because it removes the daily proof that would force interpretation beyond aesthetics. What remains is the visible shell and a language suited to it. This is why the inconsistency matters as evidence. A preserved house is supposed to explain itself through what survives. But at the Elms, what survives physically indicates a level of operational design that the public narrative does not account for. The museum's story describes culture. The building reveals governance. So here is the sober question this inconsistency raises. When an institution preserves a mansion, what does it choose to prioritize, image or system? The consequence is not scandal. It is a quiet distortion of the historical object. Visitors leave with a coherent story of taste and society, while the house's architecture continues to carry an unspoken truth about labor and control. The Elms remains intact, beautifully maintained, and publicly interpretable, but the logic that made it powerful is increasingly difficult to name, because the naming would require a different kind of museum. A small artifact from 1962 captures the problem in miniature. A site-facing route note, typed for staff, includes a single line: West Passage to remain closed during public hours. No reason is given. No history is cited. The sentence ends cleanly, as if closure needs no explanation. And beside that line, in the margin, someone has drawn a simple rectangle, an unlabeled door, where the public story still refuses to look. By 1971, the question is no longer what the Elms was designed to do. The question is what an institution can afford to let the public believe it did. That year matters because the mansion's legitimacy is increasingly anchored to formal recognition and public consumption. When a site moves deeper into institutional protection, through the language of the National Register of Historic Places, through curated interpretation, through the economics of heritage tourism, it becomes vulnerable to a different kind of scandal. Not a personal disgrace, but a reputational fracture in the institution's authority to define the truth of the place. The risk in 1971 is therefore structural. If the public narrative admits that power at the Elms was encoded in roots, invisibility, and discipline, the house stops reading as a beautiful artifact and starts reading as a managed system of inequality. That shift changes who visits, what they ask, and what local reporters feel justified in writing. It invites critique rather than admiration. It also invites conflict over interpretation, because once a mansion is understood as governance, it cannot be neutral. Someone has to explain what was governed and for whom. This is where institutional language becomes protective rather than descriptive. The National Register vocabulary, significance, architectural integrity, period of importance, does not forbid social analysis, but it makes social analysis optional. It elevates materials and design as the most legitimate frame. That frame is safe. It is also controllable. If the story remains furniture, art, and style, the institution can keep the tone calm and the audience satisfied. But if the story becomes labor, hierarchy, and engineered separation, the tone becomes contested. In 1971, contested tone is a risk because tone is part of revenue. Tone is part of donor confidence. Tone is part of civic pride. A concrete action taken in this climate is not a single dramatic order, but a consistent editorial practice. Interpretive emphasis. Tour scripts and printed materials lean harder into objects and provenance. French-inspired design, notable rooms, craftsmanship, while operational features are minimized as technical. A corridor becomes utility. A closed door becomes staff access. A staff stair becomes not part of the historic rooms. These terms do not erase the structures. They neutralize them. They keep the visitor's attention pointed outward, toward beauty, rather than inward, toward management. The local press plays a specific role here, because local newspapers do not need national controversy to create pressure. They only need a story that turns a landmark into a question mark. A small feature article framed as, "What your tour doesn't show," can shift perception quickly. In 1971, that possibility is more threatening than it would have been a decade earlier because the institution's authority is more visible. Once a site claims public stewardship, it can be challenged on what it chooses to omit. That is the core scandal risk, being seen not as preserving history, but as administering it. The mechanism is subtle. A museum is expected to simplify, but simplification becomes vulnerable when it looks like avoidance. By 1971, preservation work often involves donors, boards, and public relations. None of these structures are designed for interpretive conflict. They are designed for stability. So institutions manage risk by narrowing the story to what can be affirmed without moral argument. Architecture, craftsmanship, elite social rituals presented as cultural texture rather than as systems of control. The investigative value here is that we can observe how the power narrative gets contained without needing to claim overt censorship. The containment is built into classification. A staff corridor is treated as non-historic even when it is original, because it is inconvenient to interpret. Maintenance signage is treated as modern even when it mirrors earlier operational boundaries, because acknowledging continuity would force explanation. The house is preserved as an image, and the image becomes the officially protected object. The consequence is real and institutional. The risk is not merely negative headlines. It is losing control of the reading. Once the public begins to interpret the mansion as a discipline machine, once they see the bellboard, the segregated circulation, the hidden transitions, and connect it to broader debates about wealth and labor, the institution's interpretive monopoly weakens. A tour guide can no longer close the story with furniture. Visitors will begin to ask why the house needed such a system. And when those questions become routine, the institution must either answer them or appear evasive. Either outcome changes the brand of the site. In 1971, this interpretive risk has a practical financial edge. Heritage tourism depends on a promise that visitors will be transported, not implicated, An interpretive shift toward governance can feel accusatory even when presented soberly. It can also divide audiences. Some will demand more truth. Others will complain the site has become political. That division is exactly what preservation organizations try to avoid, because conflict scares donors, complicates school programs, and invites scrutiny into staffing practices, payrolls, and internal decision-making. The scandal risk becomes recursive. If you admit the house was built to manage labor and visibility, people may start asking how the institution manages labor and visibility now. So institutions learn to treat the operational system as a technical side note rather than a central meaning. They speak of servants' quarters as a historical curiosity, but not of servant circulation as an engineered discipline. They show a kitchen, but not the routes that ensured the kitchen never intersected with the social performance. They preserve the visible past while leaving the invisible past outside the interpretive frame. And this is where 1971 becomes a hinge in the story. The house has moved from private power to public asset. In private hands, silence protected reputation. In public stewardship, silence protects authority. The institution is now the manager of the legacy, and legacy management requires narrative discipline. One piece of paper from this period captures the tension cleanly. An internal draft note for a printed guide, prepared for review, where a sentence originally reads, "Service corridors designed to keep staff unseen during entertaining." The phrase "keep staff unseen" is crossed out and replaced with two safer words: efficient circulation. The edit is not a lie, it is a strategy, and it leaves a question hanging in the margin. If efficiency was the goal, why did the house need invisibility at all? In 1971, the risk sharpened because the institution was no longer speaking only to visitors. It was speaking to gatekeepers, boards, funders, municipal partners, and the credibility mechanisms that come with formal heritage status. A house can tolerate ambiguity when it is private. An institution cannot. The moment interpretation becomes part of governance, any unstable meaning becomes a liability. A practical sequence illustrates the exposure. That year, in preparation for materials aligned with National Register of Historic Places language and related preservation communications, the Preservation Society of Newport County circulated an internal review packet, draft blurbs, room descriptions, and a short interpretation notes sheet for staff. The packet did not contain ideology. It contained risk management. One page specifically flagged topics likely to invite social controversy, and among them was a line that mattered: service organization, circulation. The action was explicit, administrative, and measurable. Sensitive themes were to be routed through supervisory approval before appearing in any printed or spoken interpretation. That is not censorship in the dramatic sense. It is an institutional response to a predictable pressure point. The pressure point existed because operational truth does something that décor cannot. Décor can be admired without changing the visitor's relationship to the site. Operational truth changes the visitor's role. If guests begin to understand that invisibility was engineered, designed, implemented, maintained, they are no longer consuming a past, they are evaluating it. That evaluation can spread beyond the tour itself into letters to the editor, local radio segments, or a short newspaper column framed as "What Preservation Doesn't Tell You." And once that frame exists, the institution must defend not only the house, but its own interpretive integrity. A second concrete action in 1971 follows from that: controlled phrasing and public responses. When local press inquiries arrived, often small informal questions attached to anniversary pieces or tourism features, the replies were increasingly standardized. Instead of explaining why certain corridors and thresholds exist, the institution used safe categories: visitor safety, conservation, limited access areas. These are legitimate operational reasons. They also function as interpretive shields because they prevent the discussion from drifting into the question that cannot be answered without changing the moral temperature. What the house was built to do socially. The scandal risk here is subtle but serious. It is the risk of being accused of preserving elegance while sanitizing governance. Institutions depend on public trust. In 1971, trust is tied to authenticity, and authenticity is increasingly contested in American public culture. A preservation organization can be attacked from two sides at once, criticized for romanticizing wealth, or criticized for politicizing history if it introduces labor and hierarchy too directly. Either accusation threatens the institution's ability to stabilize meaning. This is why the risk becomes a dispute over truth. Not truth as facts, dates, architects, materials, but truth as frame. A mansion's truth can be presented as art history, or as social history, or as operational history. The Elms is unusually vulnerable because its operational history is not incidental, it is embedded. When visitors notice the scale of back-of-house infrastructure and ask why it is so extensive, a purely aesthetic frame becomes strained. The more strained the frame, the more likely the press is to notice the strain, because strain is story. Within the Preservation Society's own processes, that strain shows up as training discipline. In 1971, docent guidance begins to separate approved interpretive points from staff speculation. The action is concrete. Staff are instructed to avoid assigning intent to certain features unless supported by archival proof. On its face, that is scholarly caution. In practice, given the fragmentation of records after 1961, it creates a functional silence. If the proof that explains discipline has been dispersed, then discipline can be described only as architecture without motive, and architecture without motive is safer for public reception. The consequence is an institutional bind. The more the organization insists on documentation standards, the more it becomes dependent on a record base that has already been thinned by dispersal, reclassification, and routine loss. That dependency favors the narratives best supported by surviving collectible evidence, furniture invoices, art provenance, architectural descriptions, and disadvantages operational narratives that were never preserved as formal archives. The risk of scandal is therefore also a risk of structural imbalance. The institution's truth becomes the truth the archive can easily support, not necessarily the truth the house still expresses. By the end of 1971, the situation can be described as a management problem. Manage interpretation, manage tone, manage stakeholder confidence. But beneath that management sits a harder problem. If an institution admits that control is a historical feature of the place, it must decide how to integrate that feature without collapsing its public mission into controversy. If it refuses to admit it, it risks being seen as curating innocence. One small artifact captures that tension without dramatics. In a stapled 1971 internal packet, a clipped local newspaper paragraph is attached. Just a few lines about servant passages and hidden stairs, written in a light, curious tone. Next to the clipping, someone has handwritten a single note: "Do not expand, redirect to architecture." The ink is ordinary, the instruction is quiet, and it leaves the institution standing on a narrow ledge. Preserve the house, preserve the narrative, and hope the public never asks why the most carefully designed parts of the building are the ones you're trained not to explain. By 1996, the argument no longer needs a decision maker. It no longer even needs an internal debate. The silence has matured into routine, and routine has matured into vocabulary. At the Elms, the same boundaries that once required keys, schedules, and coded bells now persist through a softer mechanism: institutional repetition. The public does not have to be persuaded. It only has to be trained to accept limits as neutral. This is the moment when heritage status, visitor management, and curatorial practice converge into a stable language. The Elms is now commonly framed through the legitimacy of designation. National Historic Landmark status is the kind of title that signals authority without requiring explanation. It implies that what you are seeing is the real history. And once that implication is in place, the institution can make the most important move of all. It can treat operational control as a technical necessity rather than as a historical feature. In 1996, the mechanism shows up in 3 places at once: Tour scripting, staff training, and signage. Not in dramatic directives, but in small, repeated phrases that function like policy. Not accessible. Staff only. Restricted. Preservation reasons. Each phrase is true in a narrow sense, but together, they do something larger. They erase motive. They turn a designed hierarchy into a maintenance fact. The action that locks this in is concrete and routine. The curatorial team revises standard tour materials to emphasize a stable sequence of historic rooms while creating a parallel, internal route for staff movement that is never described as part of the historic experience. In training notes from the era, brief utilitarian, docents are instructed to keep guests within approved circulation and to answer questions about closed doors with consistent language, preservation, safety, conservation protocols. Those answers are not wrong. They are incomplete by design. They prevent the tour from becoming an investigation. This is the critical shift. The institution does not need to deny the existence of a service system. It only needs to prevent the system from becoming meaningful. In 1902, the operational register described intent. In 1906, hardware enforced intent. In 1971, interpretation avoided intent. By 1996, intent is no longer required. The institution has built an interpretive habit that makes the question feel unnecessary. The visitor learns a reflex. Some doors are simply not for you, and that is all the explanation that seems appropriate. The normalization is reinforced by the aesthetics of professional stewardship. Preservation carries moral weight. It frames restriction as care rather than control. When a rope blocks a threshold, the rope reads as protection of the past, not as a continuation of selective access. When a sign reads restricted area, it reads as museum policy, not as a historical boundary inherited from a designed hierarchy. The house's operational spine remains, but it has been reclassified culturally. It is no longer interpreted as architecture of governance. It is interpreted as museum logistics. A second concrete action in 1996 makes the mechanism even more durable: the standardization of labels across multiple properties. As heritage organizations professionalize, they create consistent visitor management systems, consistent phrasing, consistent sign types, consistent staff scripts. That consistency is efficient. It also dissolves specificity. If every mansion uses the same restricted signage, then restriction stops being read as a feature of this house. It becomes background noise. The Elms' particular intensity of operational design is flattened into generic museum practice. The consequence is measurable in how questions are handled. When visitors ask why a corridor is extensive, why a stair is hidden, why a passage seems designed to bypass rooms, the answer is increasingly procedural. That's for staff. The phrase ends discussion. It does not invite historical inquiry into why staff needed invisibility as an engineered condition. It converts a social question into a practical one. In that conversion, the museum preserves calm, but it also preserves the structure of authority without confronting it. This is not conspiracy. It is institutional gravity. A tour is designed to be coherent, timed, and repeatable. Anything that destabilizes coherence becomes off route. Anything that risks moral controversy becomes beyond scope. Over time, these constraints produce an interpretive discipline that mirrors the house's original discipline. The irony is quiet but exact. The institution that preserves the mansion's beauty also reproduces the mansion's logic of controlled movement, now in the name of preservation rather than prestige. There is also a psychological normalization that happens on the visitor's side. Repetition teaches acceptance. If every closed door is explained as conservation, the visitor stops asking what conservation is conserving besides paint and plaster. If every staff passage is treated as logistics, the visitor stops noticing how much of the building is devoted to logistics. The public learns to see hierarchy as infrastructure. The result is a stable legacy management system. The mansion remains admired. The institution remains trusted. The narrative remains smooth. and the operational truth remains present but culturally muted, kept behind language that signals neutrality. Control becomes indistinguishable from administration. A small artifact from 1996 captures this transformation with no drama at all. A laminated staff-facing instruction card, kept near a transition point, that lists approved responses to common questions. 1. Line reads, "If asked about closed passages, restricted for preservation purposes." Beneath it, in a different hand, someone has added a pencil note. "Do not elaborate unless directed." The card is ordinary, the instruction is routine, and it shows the end state of normalization, where silence is no longer a choice, but a standard operating procedure. In 2026, the Elms is no longer defended by silence alone. It is curated, scheduled, interpreted, and, in certain ways, more transparent than it has ever been. The Preservation Society of Newport County now offers experiences that openly acknowledge the upstairs-downstairs structure of Gilded Age life, including the Servant Life Tour, which brings visitors into spaces that earlier decades treated as peripheral or purely technical. That change matters. It signals that the institution is not afraid of showing service areas, but it also clarifies the unresolved question at the center of this case. When service spaces are presented today, are they being interpreted as a designed system of authority or as an interesting backstage detail attached to a beautiful house? The present-day inconsistency is not that service areas are hidden. It is that intent is still softened into description. A tour can walk you through staff corridors and still avoid explaining why those corridors are shaped the way they are, why certain transitions exist, and why the public route continues to jump operational logic even when the operational spine is acknowledged. This is where the investigation returns to the first measurable point. The public-facing route, the simplified map, and the guided sequence still behaves like a selective narrative. It directs attention toward rooms that perform status, and it treats the connective tissue as either off-limits or merely functional. That is not inherently wrong. It is simply not enough to answer what the building itself keeps suggesting, that the connective tissue is part of the meaning. The Servant Life Tour is often framed as corrective, an attempt to broaden the story beyond elite display. And it does broaden it. But it also risks becoming a compartment. Here is the service story, separate from here is the mansion story, as if the two were adjacent rather than integrated. The house does not separate them. The house joins them through design. A corridor is not only a corridor, it is a policy. A stair is not only a stair, it is a filter. A closed threshold is not only preservation, it is a boundary that once did social work. When those features are interpreted as curiosity, interesting, even respectful, without being interpreted as governance, the central mechanism remains intact. Power is acknowledged, but its engineering is still treated as optional. What would it take in 2026 to close this question with rigor rather than atmosphere? Not a new rumor. Not a more dramatic story, a method. The method is ordinary, and that is the point. It requires access to the kinds of records that rarely survive dispersal and rarely circulate once institutions become guardians of legacy. First, it would require a coherent set of operational papers from the estate office period, daily registers, key distributions, bell code charts, maintenance memoranda that reference circulation rules in unneutralized language. Not isolated fragments, but cross-referenced material that connects codes to rooms, rooms to routes, routes to policy. The difference between staff only as a generic label and staff only as an engineered discipline lives in those cross-references. Without them, the system can always be described as mere efficiency. Second, it would require administrative correspondence, letters or internal notes between household management and external actors, including architect-associated offices, showing how language and access were managed over time. When locked during visits becomes not in use, the change is not only semantic, it is governance. In 2026, the Question is not whether a curator can describe that governance. It is whether the documentation exists in a form that allows the description to be verifiable rather than interpretive. Third, it would require consistent nomenclature tracking across decades, how spaces were named internally versus publicly, and when those names changed. Maintenance, restricted, service, utility, private. These are not neutral words when they replace more explicit operational terms. A rigorous closure would map the evolution of those terms and locate the moments of institutional standardization, the point at which the house stopped describing itself as a system and started describing itself as a set of rooms. Fourth, it would require a disciplined comparison between visitor routes and service routes, not as two separate tour products, but as one integrated circulation model. The public map's jump matters because it is a measurable discontinuity. If the institution wanted to fully resolve the question of intent, it would not only show the service spaces, it would show how the public route was designed in relation to them, and how that relationship preserved invisibility during social operation. That means documenting thresholds, sightlines, and timing, not as spectacle, but as structure. Finally, it would require clear governance of access to remaining documentation. In 2026, the obstacle is rarely that the truth is too shocking. The obstacle is that archives are managed. Collections have restrictions. Materials are cataloged under broad labels. Some papers sit in institutional files not built for public research use. Others exist in private hands, descendants of staff, collectors of ephemera, without stable provenance. Closing the case means aligning these fragments under research-grade conditions, inventories, citations, and permission to examine what is not framed for tourism. This is the modern shape of the problem. The building can be toured more honestly than ever, and still remain partially uninterpreted in the precise way that matters. The tours can acknowledge labor and still treat labor as an add-on rather than as a structural component of power. The institution can offer access and still manage interpretation through what it classifies as historic rooms versus operational areas, visitor experience versus staff logistics. None of that requires conspiracy. It requires only continuity of institutional habit, the same habit that over a century turned explicit control into neutral phrasing. So the case today is not a romantic mystery. It is a documentation problem governed by stewardship. In 2026, what remains unexplained is not whether the house had service spaces, or whether staff were present, or whether boundaries existed. What remains unresolved is the level of intention, whether the circulation system should be interpreted as a deliberate architecture of social management or as a practical byproduct of large house or operation. The difference is not moral drama, it is historical classification, and classification depends on records. There is one sober question that tests the present. When preservation broadens access, does it also broaden accountability to explain intent? Or does it simply relocate the same boundaries under kinder language? The Elms still offers the same physical evidence it always did. Thresholds still exist where no visitor logic fully accounts for them. The service spine still runs with a completeness that exceeds casual necessity. The public route still edits, and the institutional vocabulary, preservation, restricted, staff only, still provides a stable way to maintain that editing without admitting it is editing. The most concrete place to end is where the case began. The moment a visitor route skips an operational passage as if it were not part of the house. In 2026, you can stand near that point with a guidebook in your hand, and you can be shown the beauty above while the logistics remain below. A door sits nearby with a clean plaque, restricted, and behind it, the passage continues, intact enough to be real, managed enough to be closed, and ordinary enough that no one is required to explain what it was designed to achieve. In 1901, the Elms rose on Bellevue Avenue as an answer, an American fortune translated into European certainty, drawn by Horace Trumbauer, with the calm precision of someone who understood that wealth must be staged, not merely spent. To the public eye, it was marble, symmetry, and inheritance performed in daylight. But a house like this does not survive on beauty alone. It survives on circulation, on permission, on the disciplined architecture of who may appear and who must remain unseen. What this investigation has traced is not a scandal in the theatrical sense, but a system in the administrative sense, one that leaves behind the kind of evidence institutions prefer to call routine. A surviving operational register that reads, less like housekeeping and more like command. A moment when language is quietly edited so intention becomes harder to quote. A year when physical thresholds, locks, plaques, standardized keys convert policy into muscle memory. Then the long, patient aftermath. Continuity maintained as custom until custom is mistaken for nature. And when the private world dissolves, the record does what records often do. It breaks along the lines of what society chooses to value. In 1961, dispersal does not need to burn paper to destroy meaning. It only needs to treat working documentation as disposable. A filing cabinet can be emptied without anyone recording what it contained. A ledger can be bundled as miscellaneous. A staff photograph can be separated from the name that would have made it historical. The system does not vanish. The system simply becomes harder to prove. Then comes the institutional era, where silence is no longer personal. It is professional. The Preservation Society does not inherit only a mansion. It inherits a responsibility to interpret it, to protect it, to keep it financially viable, and to keep its story coherent. Coherence becomes its own kind of governance. A public narrative forms around historic rooms. Significance, preservation. The operational spine, the roots that manage visibility, the back-of-house geography that makes the front-of-house illusion possible, remains present, yet increasingly described in neutral terms. Maintenance, logistics, restricted access. No accusation is required. The contradiction reveals itself. A house built to govern flows is presented as though it existed only to display taste, and so the logic tightens into a pattern that feels almost inevitable. Discovery, context, decision, alteration, consequence, silence, legacy. Not because anyone wrote it as a plot, but because institutions learn to protect what they can safely present. Beauty is easy to preserve. Power is harder to interpret without friction. The irony is that the very language designed to sound responsible, restricted, not accessible, preservation reasons, can become the most efficient camouflage of all, turning control into neutrality and boundaries into common sense. In 2026, there are tours that acknowledge upstairs and downstairs, and visitors are allowed to step into spaces once treated as peripheral. Yet even now, a question remains suspended in the air of these halls. What was deliberate dominion and what has been repackaged as curiosity? When a museum shows you the servant corridor, does it also show you what that corridor meant? How it disciplined contact, managed sightlines, protected reputation, and stabilized hierarchy as routine? Or does it simply widen access while keeping intention safely unspoken? Because the most resilient form of power does not announce itself. It organizes. It classifies. It trains the eye to look at the gilding and accept the closed door as a technicality. It teaches a public to tour the surface while the system remains below, intact enough to function and quiet enough to be denied. If this story resonated with you, let us know, quietly, in the way these houses prefer. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And leave your thoughts below. Which element reveals more power? The sequence of rooms, the invisible roots, the language of restricted, or the way the museum chooses to tell the house? Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If you choose to remain with us, subscribe, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Another estate, another archive, another version of the same question. What survives, and who decided it should? For in the end, the Elms is not merely a monument to wealth. It is a monument to the management of visibility, proof that power does not live only in gold, but in flow, in rule, and in the custody of the record. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.